I'm really glad that all of you could attend this session today. It's a really exciting session. Early warning systems are a really exciting tool that really bridges research to practice and really helps schools and districts and states make data and research actionable. So I think that you'll really enjoy it. It's really a nice bridge. But before we get started and before I introduce our panelists, I did want to give you just a little bit of context about the background and the research and the dropout problem. I'm sure they're all things that you've seen before, but I thought I'd just give you a little bit of context. So why is it so important that we make the information and early warning systems, and why is it so important to take action towards early warning systems? So if you look at the statistics, they're pretty dire. 7,000 students drop out of high school every day. And nearly 25% of students with disabilities still don't graduate. And then I think 84% of minorities actually attend what's called dropout factories, which are those schools where less than 60% of the students graduate. These are really big issues that everyone is struggling with. And when you see statistics like these, it tends to reify the problem and make it really difficult to understand how you could actually go about changing things in your school. And I just wanted to also point out the economic consequences of dropping out. This is a study in 2000. A new high school dropout in 2000 had less than a 50% chance of getting a job. I'm sure that you'll all agree with me that they're probably even less likely to get a job considering the current economy. And I know that with family members that I've known who have been even applying for jobs who didn't even have a college degree, because there's been so many people applying for these jobs, the HR systems have created these computers that sift through all the applications. And so for a relative of mine who didn't have a college degree, she couldn't even get her application on the table, even though she had over 30 years of experience. You can imagine how magnified that problem would be for a dropout. So another interesting thing is that even just cutting the number in half, cutting the number of dropouts in half, it would reap about $45 billion in revenues and decreased costs, according to a 2007 study. So that's what brings us here today. The concept of the early warning system is one whereby you can use data to identify students who are at risk while they're still in school. And that's really critical because retrieving students once they've dropped out of school is very costly and very difficult. The presenters that we have here today will talk about a variety of aspects of the early warning systems. Julia Gwynne, who's in the far right here, will begin with some information about research on the indicators that are included in an early warning system, so as well as the thresholds that indicate whether a student is likely to drop out. Lindsay is a colleague of mine at the National High School Center, and we're both actually on the early warning system team. And she is going to present a tool that actually integrates the work that Julia and her colleagues have done at the Consortium for Chicago School Research into a tool that can be used by states, districts, and schools to start to look at this data in a way that is very accessible and actionable by stakeholders. And then last is Kathleen Smith. She's the Director of School Improvement at the Virginia State Department of Education, and she's been embarking on a journey with the National High School Center on a collaborative project that we've developed to focus on early warning systems and rolling these out throughout rolling an early warning system and the use of an early warning system in schools that have a graduation or dropout problem so that they can use this tool to make data actionable. So she's really, from the state, going to give a state perspective as well as a district perspective on how this can actually be rolled out. And the tool that Virginia uses is actually based on the National High Schools tool that is developed that will be demoed by Lindsay, but it has some slight tweaks and customization, which you'll see or hear about. So before we, I should also say I'm Susan Therriault. I'm sorry, I didn't even introduce myself. And I am from the National High School Center. I'm a technical assistance liaison. And I'd like to just ask if everyone could shut off their cell phones because it does interfere with the recording. And also, I wanted to let you know the format of the session will be such that each person will present, and then we'll have a few moments for questions and answers, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have a little time when we can have some table discussions. All right, thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Good afternoon, everyone. I gotta find my... Okay, my name is Julia Gwynne, and I'm a researcher at the Consortium on Chicago School Research here in Chicago. Today, I am going to present some of my recent research that looks at two groups of students, students with disabilities and English language learners. And the work that I'm going to present today is really a continuation of some work that two of my colleagues, John Easton and Elaine Allensworth, started quite a few years ago. Back in 2007, Allensworth and Easton put out a report called What Matters for Staying on Track and Graduating in Chicago Public Schools. And this report really showed that how students do in their 9th grade classes is extremely predictive of whether or not they are likely to graduate from high school 4 years later. The work was really innovative because it turns out that 9th grade course performance is far more predictive of graduation than either background characteristics or test scores. So it really helped to reshape the emphasis that honing in more, getting away from risk factors and honing in more on this idea of indicators in terms of predicting graduation. So today we're going to do a few things. I'm going to extremely quickly describe the findings from the original What Matters report, and then I'm going to replicate those findings for students with disabilities. If we have time, I'm going to then talk about some factors that contribute to the weak course performance of students with disabilities. And then we're going to change gears and move on to English language learners. And we will replicate the findings from What Matters for this subgroup. And finally, again, if we have time, we're going to look at factors, other factors that contribute to differences in graduation rates. So fasten your seatbelts. I have 58 slides. So as I mentioned, the original What Matters report really underscored the importance of freshman year in terms of looking at whether or not kids were likely to graduate from high school. This report looked at 4 indicators of performance that are available at different time points during the year. They focused initially on what we call the on-track indicator, but they also looked at 3 other indicators: course failures, GPA, and absences. For those of you who may not be familiar, the on-track indicator is just a measure of progress during the first year of high school. A student is considered to be on track if he or she has no more than 1 semester F in a core subject, and if he or she has accumulated 5 full course credits, which in Chicago's case is the number that's required to move on to 10th grade. That's based on Chicago's policy. And the authors of the original report showed that students who are on track at the end of 9th grade are 4 times more likely to graduate than students who are off track. And so this is an extremely useful predictor for identifying kids who may be heading off the rails, not likely to graduate. But the on-track indicator is really only available to schools at the end of the school year, which is not so helpful necessarily. So they looked at other relationships, which the relationship between other indicators, and these can be actually available earlier on during the school year. This shows the relationship between GPA and graduation, and I'm going to fly through these next few slides. But you can see that kids who have a B average at the end of their freshman year are extremely likely to graduate, whereas those who, at the bottom end of the distribution, very few of them are likely to graduate. This is the relationship between course failures and graduation. Again, extremely good predictor. Looking at the number of classes students fail during their freshman year is a very good indicator of whether or not they're likely to graduate. And then, I apologize for flying through this, but They also looked at the relationship between absences. So students who miss less than a week of school each semester are pretty likely to graduate, but with each additional week of school missed, dropout rates or graduation rates drop considerably. So after this report came out, the National High School Center came back to us and asked the question, do these course performance indicators predict graduation in the same way for subpopulations of students, so for students with disabilities and for English language learners, as they do for the general population? Can we use these indicators to predict who's likely to drop out of high school for different populations of students? So it turns out that these two groups present a very interesting contrast. So students with disabilities, in general, you will see have rather weak course performance. They have very low graduation rates, but the relationship between the indicators and graduation is quite strong. When you look at English language learners, we see a slightly different scenario. So here, at least in Chicago, these students have average to above average course performance. They have average to above average graduation rates, but still the relationship between the indicators and graduation is quite strong. So in other words, even though the course performance and graduation rates of these two populations of students are very different, the indicators can be used in the same way to identify students who may be at risk of dropping out. So I'm going to take you on a very quick replication of the original What Matters report for students with disabilities. In the original report, we looked at 7 groups of students, 5 of which were students with disabilities, those highlighted in blue, and 2 of which were students without identified disabilities. One of these top 2 categories are students who have very weak academic skills. They enter high school 2 or more years below grade level, but for whatever reason have never been referred to special education. As you'll see, these students are really struggling in high school. So first we're going to do a quick review of how these students are doing in their classes. And in general, you see 3 tiers of performance. So students without an identified disability, students with physical sensory disabilities, or speech language disabilities tend to have the highest levels of performance. Here you can see that 2/3 of these 3 groups of students are on track at the end of their freshman year. The middle tier of performance are those who have a learning disability or mild cognitive disability. They're circled in green. And about half of them tended to be on track at the end of their freshman year. And then the students who were really struggling by the end of their freshman year are those who entered high school 2 or more years below grade level and students with emotional disturbance. Same basic pattern here, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is course failures and GPA. Same general pattern. And absences. Here, students who are 2 or more years below grade level look a little bit more like students with learning disabilities. So when we turn to graduation rates, again, we see roughly this same pattern. The students with the highest graduation rates are those, not surprisingly, who don't have an identified disability or those who have physical sensory or speech language disability. In the middle tier, we see only about half of these students graduating, those with learning disability and those with mild cognitive disability, and also about half of these students who enter high school 2 or more years below grade level. Students with emotional disturbances have a staggeringly low graduation rate of only 25%. It's a very, very dire situation. Now we're going to turn to looking at the relationship between the indicators and graduation. So this chart shows the percent of students graduating by their on-track status. So you can see that in the first column, students without identified disabilities, 87% of them who were on track graduate, and here we're reporting 5-year graduation rates within 5 years. Only 31% who were off track graduate. So for each of these 5 categories of students, and I should stop and say, since students with physical sensory disabilities and speech language disabilities look so similar to students without identified disabilities, we actually condensed this graph just to focus on these 3 groups. But you can see that the relationship between the indicator and graduation is generally the same. Students who are on track are between 2 and 4 times more likely to graduate than students who are off track. Now, you can also see that graduation rates are lower within each category for students with emotional disturbances. So Only 57% of on-track students are graduating compared to 77% who are on track but have a learning disability. But the takeaway here is that the indicator is still identifying kids who are likely to graduate and still useful for identifying kids who are not likely to graduate. There may be other factors that are affecting the likelihood of graduation for some of these populations of students, but in general, the indicator can be used in the same way. And that is true when we look at each of the other 3 indicators. So this is looking at graduation rates by course failures. Again, you can see that students with no course failures, students who pass all of their classes, are extremely likely to graduate, but that likelihood drops off with each successive course failure. Again, among students with emotional disturbances, overall graduation rates are lower in each category. Just showing you the same basic pattern shows across each of these indicators. So now we've seen that the relationship is rather obvious among students with disabilities. In general, their course performance is very weak, and their graduation rates are low. So weak course performance is driving lower graduation rates. But what's driving weak course performance? It turns out we looked at a number of different explanations: background characteristics, the types of schools in which they were enrolled in, and also their behavior. So it turns out that while background characteristics do explain some of the differences in GPA and course failures, the most important factor driving low GPA and high course failures was their very low rates of attendance. If students with disabilities had higher rates of attendance, it's likely that they would have looked more similar to students without disabilities in terms of their overall GPA and their number of course failures. So absences was really a critical phenomenon here. Understanding why students with disabilities are out of school as much as they are is a really important phenomenon. I should say, everyone always asks me, do you differentiate between an excused and unexcused absences? And we weren't able to do that at this point. But the takeaway can be the same. Whether it's an excused absence or an unexcused absence, being out of the classroom is extremely problematic. We've done a lot of additional research on why teachers give the grades that they do. And oftentimes, what distinguishes between teachers pay a lot of attention to whether or not students are doing what they're supposed to be doing, whether or not they're coming to class, whether or not they're doing their homework. So coming to class regularly we found was really an important phenomenon driving lower GPAs for students with disabilities. I sort of talked through this. I do want to highlight this last bullet point here. But students, there is this small, in Chicago it was a smallish group, but there are some students who, for whatever reason, enter high school with very weak skills. These are students in the 2 below category, but clearly need additional support. They were really struggling. If you recall back in the course performance, they were a group that was really struggling. And being 2 or more years below grade level is not necessarily a prerequisite for being in special ed, but these were, regardless of whether or not they should have been in special ed or some other support, these students were clearly struggling. So I think that's worthy of noting. We're going to quickly turn now to English language learners. And for this report, we focused on 4 categories of students. So we're looking at the 9th grade course performance. So current ELLs are students who have not achieved proficiency by 9th grade. We look at also a group of students who were recently proficient. They achieved proficiency within 3 years prior to 9th grade. We look at students who were at one point ELL but achieved proficiency well before 9th grade, 4 more years. And then we look at students who were never ELLs. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm only focusing on Hispanic students because they comprise the largest group of ELL students in Chicago. Around 80% of current and former ELLs are Hispanic. So we're going to do the same process. Here, though, we're going to go through each of the indicators and then look at their relationship with graduation. For these slides, I have added a black bar which shows the sort of district average across each of these indicators. And you'll see something that's interesting. At least among Hispanic students, the best performing group are long-term proficient students. Students who were at some point ELL but have been proficient for 4 or more years. The second highest achieving group are current ELLs. This is in terms of course performance, but when we get to graduation rates, you'll see a different pattern. So here, long-term proficient students have the fewest course failures. Current ELLs are next, and then the two groups with the highest course failures are recently proficient and the never ELLs. Again, I should add too, differences are small here, so not huge differences, but the pattern generally remains the same. So best performing are students who are long-term proficient. Fewest absences are students who are long-term proficient, followed by current ELLs. So now we're going to look at 4- and 5-year graduation rates. So here we see a change in our pattern. Long-term proficient students do have the highest 5-year graduation rates. 75% of them will graduate from high school in 5 years, compared to a district average of 66%. Just after that are students who were never ELLs, followed by recently proficient students. But current ELLs have quite significantly lower graduation rates. But as you'll see, the relationship between the indicators still holds. So on track, I apologize, I'm not sure what's happening on the bottom of my slide, but on track is still a very good predictor of graduation. Students who are on track at the end of their freshman year are between 2 and 3 times more likely to graduate, even though you see in the second set of bars that current ELL students have somewhat lower graduation rates within each category. Same basic story for each of the indicators. So here we've just now seen that current ELLs actually are doing reasonably okay in their classes. Their course performance, at least in Chicago, can be considered average, but their graduation rates are much lower. They differ by 13 percentage points from the graduation rates of long-term proficient students. So here we decide to explore other factors that may contribute to these lower graduation rates of current ELL students. Somewhat similar enterprise. We looked at background characteristics. We looked at 9th grade course performance. We looked at the schools in which students are enrolled, and we also looked at other factors, including educational aspirations, time spent working, and mother's education level. It turned out that of those other factors, the one that was most important was, I'm going to skip over this, is just differences in background characteristics. The one that was most important were educational aspirations. So you can see here that our first category are current ELLs, and 30% of them expected to terminate their education at the end of high school, compared to only 10% of long-term proficient students. So it turned out that this actually was quite a big factor. There are differences in educational aspirations. The fact, I've glossed over this, but they also tend to be enrolled in academically weaker schools. They're much less likely to be in selective high schools compared to long-term proficient students. And then 2 other phenomenons, which I sort of glossed over in the interest of time, but they tend to enter high school at older ages. So many of these students have had gaps in their education, and by the time they get to high school, they tend to be much older, and being old for grade has consistently been shown to be a predictor of dropping out. And they also have higher rates of school mobility, so they tend to bounce around a little bit more from school to school, at least in Chicago. So just to summarize, I'm running out of time quickly, but just to summarize, freshman year indicators are strong predictions of graduation for English language learners, just as they were also for students with disabilities. Among Hispanic students, current ELLs tend to have somewhat worse course performance than long-term proficient, and somewhat better course performance than recently proficient. But they tend to have much lower graduation rates, more than their course performance would suggest. So some of these other factors to pay attention to in terms of understanding lower graduation rates are their school enrollment, educational aspirations, and the fact that they are older for high school when they enter, and prior mobility. I hope that wasn't too crazy fast. I felt like I was flying through there.
Thank you, Julia. So we are a little short on time, but I'm wondering if anyone has any questions. I can walk the mic over, or you could come up here. Hold on, I see one. I might need you to walk.
Julia,
Yes.
I got kind of lost in the speed of the presentation.
I'm sorry.
No problem. But my question is, your data that you presented, what is it that you want us to carry away? And then number 2, the information that was presented is like what we all kind of know on the surface. So the fact that you gave us the information or the ethnic group that was driving your ELL numbers, but what ethnic group was driving your your students with disability numbers?
You know, so let me go back to your first question first. I think the central takeaway here, since we're interested in understanding predictors for graduation, we can say that the central message here is that even though we have different populations of students who may have different types of course performance, who may do differently in their classes, the central message is the same. So these course performance indicators are very useful for identifying students who may be likely to drop out of high school. They can be used in the 9th grade year, and early identification should lead to early intervention, right? So if you have a tool that can be used in the same way for different groups of students, that's much better than having to kind of reconfigure a tool that has to be used differently for different populations. So that's the central takeaway here is even though students with disabilities look different from ELL students, the indicators work in the same way for identifying kids who are likely to graduate versus likely not to graduate. In terms of your second question is what were the background characteristics of students with disabilities? They tend to be, I apologize for glossing over that, in Chicago, they tend to be disproportionately African American, they tend to be disproportionately male students, they tend to be disproportionately from low-income neighborhoods. But there is, despite those those overriding characteristics or those generalized statements, there is still diversity within those groups. But what's interesting is it's not their background characteristics that's driving whether or not they're likely to drop out. It's how they're doing in their classes. So regardless of who they are as a person, how they do in their classes is kind of is the best predictor of whether or not they are at risk of dropping out.
African-American male, the stress education rate has been an issue for a number of years, and it's well researched and well documented. So I was just asking because even though you presented the information, kind of what the next step would be, because we know that African-American males are overpopulated in special education from New York, California.
For sure.
Research tends to shun away from associating the lowest educational level with future student performance. So I'm interested in why you include that as one of your background characteristics.
Well, there was old research that shows a relationship between parents' education and whether or not you're likely to graduate from high school. So I just was interested in seeing if that might be a factor. It turned out not to be relevant at all. It turned out that educational aspirations were more of an issue, at least in terms of explaining differences between two groups of students, current ELLs. And, I can only speculate here. I don't know why they have lower aspirations. Maybe it's because they don't view the educational system as a good vehicle for their own advancement. Maybe it's really important to their family to get into the workforce as quickly as possible. I can speculate, but I can't know for sure. But it is noteworthy that at least in this population of students, they did have substantially lower educational aspirations, and that was at least associated with their likelihood of dropping out.
Can I just say one thing, too? Having worked on the early warning systems with schools and districts and states, one thing that we really like about the indicators that Chicago looks at is that they really are just symptoms. They're symptoms of engagement. So the idea of things like characteristics like, your race, your ethnicity, or your mother's education, those are things that a student can't change. But if you're looking at early warning indicators over time, you want students to be able to move fluidly to be flagged as at risk or be able to come back on. So the idea is, I think one of the key takeaways we've taken from Julia's work is that, yeah, these are just symptoms. There are more questions to ask, and so she goes to that next step and asks those questions. And what it really means is maybe different students actually need different kinds of supports. If the reasons why they're disengaging from school are the same in terms of symptoms, but they may be different there are underlying differences among them. So you would treat them differently because of that. That's sort of how we've approached that next step. And, there's still, those are just basic kind of things that you looked at, but there's still more to be done if you were working with one-on-one. And if you were working in a school, you could even go deeper and find out what the reasons were. I had one more question, and then we're going to move on to Lindsay.
I guess it's kind of an extension of her question. When you looked at the failure rate and why students were, failing classes, did you look at what caused that? Did it correlate to attendance or behavior, or, you know what I mean? Was there?
Yep. We only did actually that exercise for students with disabilities. And again, I apologize for speeding so quickly. Let's see if I can find it in here. But so the question is, why do students with disabilities fail so many more classes and have much lower GPAs than students without disabilities? And we looked at a range of different possible explanations. It could be their background. It could be that they're much more likely to come from low-income neighborhoods or have higher prior school mobility. In Chicago, it's the case that students with disabilities tend to be concentrated in neighborhood schools with very low achievement. That could be driving lower course performance. And then we looked at this category of freshman year behavior. We looked at the relationship between absences and GPA, and also the relationship between study habits and GPA. And it turns out if you're comparing students with and without disabilities, at least we measure study habits based on survey responses, and they appear to have very similar study habits. Students with disabilities report studying as much as students without disabilities, but where they really differ and what really mattered was this absences category. Students with disabilities were likely to be far more absent than students without disabilities, and that was driving their much lower GPA and their much higher course failures. So really understanding what's driving, if it's, as Lindsay says, this is a symptom. Understanding why students with disabilities are away from school much more is a really critical. Is it about engagement? Is it about developing, if learning has become such a challenging experience, is there just a sort of general distaste for schooling? But so really sort of focusing in on the absences issue turns out to be, at least in Chicago, a really central phenomenon for understanding high course failures and low GPA.
Thank you. I'm just going to limit the questions. We'll have another opportunity at the end to ask. Okay, come over here. You have to talk into the mic.
I'd be very curious to see the correlation between the expectations of the adults, teacher, parents, in relation to low achievement. If there's going to be some research, I think that'd be some added research to look at.
Yes, no doubt.
Thank you. So Julia just gave us the research aspect of the early warning systems. And now Lindsay is going to explain an implementation cycle, so how to make this information actionable by showing you both an implementation cycle as well as a tool that can be used at the school and district levels to actually use this information.
Great, thanks, Susan. So what an early warning system is a tool or system that relies on this readily available, easily accessed data housed at the school and district level, and now increasingly at the state level, to predict which students, based off of certain risk factors, which we'll look at, who are at risk for dropping out of high school. And then you can target your resources based on who you see is at risk to help these students get back on track for graduation before they actually drop out of school. And the early warning system also allows you, based on the data that you look at with your students, to examine patterns among students. So there's certain subgroups of students who are dropping out of high school, and identify school climate issues that can be addressed on a larger level to help get your students back on track for graduation. And just quickly to review the indicators that Julia talked about, she presented the research behind them, and these are the exact indicators that our tool tracks to identify students who are at risk for dropout. So we look at pre-high school indicators of risk, which the school or district can locally validate and locally choose to determine who is at risk for dropout. And some of these things that we've worked with schools to look at are middle school suspensions, course failures in certain classes, attendance rates as well. Then we also look at attendance rates at 3 different periods: the first 20 or 30 days of school, each grading period, and then at the end of year. And if within any of these periods a student misses 10% or more of instructional time, they are flagged as being at risk for dropout. Then we look at course failures both during each grading period and at the end of the year. And if a student fails one or more course in any subject, they are at risk for dropping out of high school in our tool. And then looking at GPA during, again, each grading period at the end of the year. If a student earns a 2.0 or lower on a 4.0 GPA scale, they are flagged for as being at risk for dropout. And then lastly, the Consortium on Chicago's school research end-of-year on-track indicator, which Julia talked about. And this is an indicator that takes some of the information within the tool and kind of meshes it together to make this on-track indicator. So if you fail 2 or more semester core courses or accumulate fewer credits than the number required for promotion to the next grade, you're flagged in our tool as being at risk for dropout. So over the last couple of years, we've worked with some states, mainly Kathleen in Virginia and in Texas as well, to establish this implementation cycle and process of how we implement the early warning system tool. So the tool is simply not used in isolation, but rather as part of this process that is a back and forth process going around feedback evaluation to see how this work is moving forward. So in step 1 of the process, you establish roles and responsibilities on an early warning system team. And this can be a team that is incorporated into other aspects of your high school, so it may be part of a high school improvement team. But the main point is that there's specific individuals responsible for doing the EWS work. And the team will meet regularly and communicate dropout prevention issues to the larger community and other stakeholders who are interested in this work. In step 2, you actually use the EWS tool, and I'm going to demo the tool for you in a little bit. But the people who are on the early warning system team, at least 1 or 2 people should be responsible for regularly entering data into the tool, because this is the most important aspect in making sure that the tool is properly identifying the students who are at risk for dropout. And some of the reports, each person on the team should be able to look and analyze the reports that come out of the tool to determine how to help get the students who are at risk back on track for graduation. And I've passed out a bunch of different reports that the tool has to offer to you, and you can look at those during the presentation, and I will also demonstrate a lot of them to you. In step 3, the team looks at who is identified as at risk for dropout and then reviews some of the patterns in the data. So at the student level, what does your data tell you about individual students who are at risk? Are there certain subgroups who are dropping out more than others? And then school level patterns. What does your data tell you about how the school is doing? Are there students who were on track at the beginning of the year then falling off track? And are there students, conversely, are there students getting back on track for graduation? And what's going on to help these students? In step 4, we've mentioned it a couple times here today, moving beyond what the tool is telling you. So the indicators in the tool are just observable symptoms or behaviors that students are demonstrating that make them at risk for dropout. So again, not attending school or failing courses. And these are the symptoms and the behaviors that they're displaying, but they're not the actual root causes for why the students are dropping out of high school. So you should examine additional data and talk to other people to figure out what's going on with these students to help them get back on track for graduation. And looking at the data beyond the indicators can really help you raise new questions and understand why these students are falling off track for graduation, and really move away from those preconceived notions about what types of students are dropping out of high school, and really using the data to determine who we should be intervening with, moving away again from those ideas of who we think might be dropping out. In step 5 here, once you've identified the students are at risk and their specific needs, you need to assign and provide them interventions to help them get back on track for graduation. So our team recommends a tiered approach to using this, and one that Dr. Posney talked about in her last session here. So I'll breeze through it. But at tier 1, we have universal interventions that help the majority of our students. They're usually least costly, and about 80% of students will benefit from these interventions. Then moving on, a small subset of students will not benefit from these interventions and will need more specialized or targeted approaches. So about 15% of students will fall into this tier 2 category. And then moving up to the 3rd level, individualized interventions, about 5% of students will need specific individual resources targeted directly to their needs to get back on track for graduation. And I just want to note a quick resource that the High School Center put together. And what we did was looked at effective intervention programs deemed as effective by the What Works Clearinghouse, and identified common strategies that these programs had across the gambit, and identified these 14 strategies, which you can see on the left, as different things that can be implemented to help students get back on track for graduation. And if you want to know more about the crosswalk, so we crosswalked the strategies to the programs, and we have a mapping of that in one of the resources that is available on our website. It's called Approaches to Dropout Prevention, Heeding Early Warning Signs. So you can look at the crosswalk on the mapping that we did that describes each of these intervention programs to see if some of them might be applicable to your school or district. In step 6, obviously, once you've assigned students to interventions, you need to monitor their progress to see if the interventions are working. And this will allow you to make necessary changes during the course of the year, and also at the end of, and also identify students who are getting actually back on track for graduation to see if the intervention was working. And you should also involve other stakeholders to do this work to help make sure that all needs of the students are being met. And then in step 7 of this process, during the school year and at the end of the year, you should be refining and evaluating this process as you move along. So identifying your student needs that you can address individually, and then school climate needs that might be able to be addressed. And the other important thing about this process is those specific indicators and those thresholds that I mentioned in the beginning. They're preset in the tool, but you should look at your own individual data to see if different thresholds or benchmarks might more readily flag students who, in your specific context, who are at risk for dropout. So you want most of the students to fall in the accurate prediction category, where the tool is flagging them for being at risk of dropping out and they do drop out, or they are not being flagged and they graduate on time. And we want to make sure that you adapt those to your local context. So now what I'm going to do is demonstrate the actual tool that the National High School Center developed. And this tool is free to anybody, so you can download it from our website. And though I believe that's in the PowerPoints, and I'll show you the website as well where you can get this information. So what we're looking at here is the main menu of the tool. And there's 3 different columns. The tool setup column here, the data inputs column, where you actually enter information about the students, and then the outputs and reports column. So based off of the information you enter about your students, who becomes at risk for dropping out of high school. Just looking here at the school information tab, this is where, sorry, mouse is sensitive. This is where you enter information about your school or district, and there's also the ability to upload a school or district logo here. So on the ports that become printable, which I've given you samples of, you can actually have your school or district logo present on that if you want to share them with an external audience. Once you've set up this portion of the tool, you move into the tool settings portion, and this is probably the most important page on the tool. So based on how your school operates, you have the ability to adapt the tool for a quarterly system, a trimester system, or a semester system. And for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to demonstrate a quarterly system. Then here in this box, you enter the number of days in each quarter, as well as the start and end date of each grading period. And this is important to note because this is how the tool recognizes when students are falling off track or when they're getting on back on track for graduation. Then you'll also enter the GPA scale that your school operates and the number of credits it takes for students to graduate. This is incorporated into the end of year, CCSR indicator. Moving on to the bottom here, we've preset in the tool disability categories and race ethnicity categories based on common understanding, so the U.S. Census and the IDEA's 13 disability categories that they recognize. But you can also adapt these to meet your own individual needs. So if you designate your students in different categories, you can delete these and enter in your own categories. And then to the right, the English language learner status and economically disadvantaged status. Right now we have them preset in the tool as a yes or no indicator, but you can also break up these designations further if that's more applicable to your school or district. Moving over to the right side of this page, we have the ability to track initial attendance either after the first 20 or 30 days of school based on when you want to start flagging kids for being at risk based on attendance. And then the risk indicator thresholds box. So these are all the indicators that I've presented to you that our tool tracks. And these are the thresholds that are based on research out of Chicago that we've used right now to identify students who are at risk. But as you look at your data over time, you can customize these thresholds to meet your individual needs. The last part of the tool setup section is the intervention settings. So if your school or district has interventions available to you that you might assign students who are at risk for dropout, you would put them here on this page. And you can designate them as either academic, behavior, or attendance interventions, as well as a tier 1, 2, or 3 intervention if you use that tiered approach to intervention, which I talked about briefly before. And this is where any intervention that you might assign to a student will be housed here. And this becomes important later on as you start assigning your students to interventions. So now that we've set up our tool for use, we start entering information about our individual students in the second column. So in this first student information tab here, you can see that I've entered all of my students' names and IDs, as well as demographic information that relates to them. So their race and ethnicity, if they have a disability, whether or not they're economically disadvantaged. And another feature that's pretty important on this page is the enrollment status. So as we all know, over the course of the year, students will enter and leave your school for various reasons. So it's important in this tool to track when that occurs, because this is, again, how the tool recognizes when students are off track for graduation, when they get back on track, or if they've left the school for a specific reason. So you have the ability to label students as enrolled, transferred out, transferred in, graduated, or dropped out. And the tool will also make sure that you note the date that this status changes, again, to make sure that we're accurately keeping records of when students' status are changing in the tool. Once you've entered the information about the students, you have the ability to enter the pre-high school indicator, which we talked about briefly. So based off of locally validated data, a school or district can choose what indicators they want to track before high school to determine if a student is at risk for dropout. And this is where you would put that information in the tool, and this becomes very relevant in the reporting features, which I'll show you here. So a student at pre-high school is either flagged yes, is at risk, or no, they're not. And there's also the ability to enter additional comments about these students so that you can keep track of what's going on with them on an individual basis. Moving to the student performance section here, we have, this is where we enter the course information and all those indicators, the actual information that the students display. So their attendance, their course failures, their GPA, and their credits earned. And the one nice feature about this tool is that all the data I've presented so far has the ability to be imported into the tool. So you can export data from your student information system, or however you house it now, and then import it into the tool by setting it in a specific format. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. Here is an example of one of those templates that I talked about. So we've already set up these templates for you. They're available on our website, which I'll show you. And basically, you just enter in the information here in this specific format, and then you can import it easily into our tool. So here, I want to import Q4 data. I click the Import Data button, browse, and choose where the file is located. Then I'll just choose that it's a comma-delimited file. This is more for probably the people who work with your data a lot will know more about this. And then the grading period I'm entering for, so grading period 4. Then I import the data, and it readily imports into our tool. So you can see it here. Now we have Q4 data, we have a set for the full year, and these year-to-date totals automatically generate. So once we've entered information about our students, we now want to look at the data that we've entered and see who's actually at risk for dropping out of high school. So we move to the student risk status page. And this page has some nice features available. We can filter by demographics, so just look at students with disabilities, students who are ELLs, or students who are economically disadvantaged. We can also filter by time frame, so looking at 1 quarter at a time if we'd like. And the students who are flagged in red are ones that have been identified as at risk based off of the data and those thresholds that we talked about. And their specific indicators for which they are flagged show up as red yeses on the right here. You'll also note students who are grayed out in this demonstration, and that means that they've left the school for some reason, so either have dropped out or transferred out. And this is captured based off of that in the enrollment status, which I showed you on the initial page. So the next step, obviously, after you've identified the students who are at risk, is to assign them to intervention based on their specific needs. So your team might sit down and discuss some of these indicators that we see here. If we're talking about specific students, we could see that Sharon Fanning's at risk for dropout, and these are the specific indicators that she's displaying. So in order to assign her to one of those interventions that we placed in the tool, we can right-click on her, and Assign to Intervention comes up here on the bottom. And then this intervention page comes up. So we'll just, looking based off of her data, we'll assign her to an intervention. And we choose from a drop-down menu based off of that list that was generated in the beginning. Just click whatever intervention we want to assign her to and enter the start date for when she needs to enter the intervention. And now the tool will recognize in the reporting features that she's in there. So we'll be able to monitor her progress over time to see how well she's doing. Now I'm just going to show you a few of the reporting features that are available in the tool. And again, I've given you several examples of the reports that are available, but there's many more that I did not print out for you. So we have school level reports, student level reports, and individual reports. The school level reports, I'll run the first one for you, are just summary reports. So they have no student identifying information and can be shared externally. They just really have totals of the specific students who are flagged and not flagged. So we see all the indicators, and then the light blue means the student's not flagged, and dark blue means they're flagged. So we have 34 kids not flagged in our school and 14 kids flagged as at risk based off of the attendance flag. There's also a nice little summary bar up here which shows you at the specific time frame you're looking at, which is Q2, who's dropped out and who's transferred out at this point in the year. So there's, again, keep giving you kind of this summary statement so you know where your students are and being able to track them over time. I'll just show you 2 more reports quickly. You can run this report for any of the demographic information, so ELL, disadvantage, and disability categories. And then I talked a lot about interventions, and that's one of the main features of our tool. So you can run an intervention report by program and see, based off of when a student's become assigned, if they're getting back on track for graduation over the course of the year. So starting with pre-high school, we had some students who are flagged, who are placed into this Check and Connect program. And looking at this report, we can see over time, is the intervention working? Are students getting back on track for graduation? And looking at these totals. So this is another nice feature that the tool has available to you. Now I'll quickly just demonstrate some of the student level reports. We have the flagged student report, which is kind of similar to that student risk status page. It just lists all the students who are flagged for dropout and shows what indicators they're flagged for and the specific time frame you're looking at. And then there's, again, this summary box, the total students, how many are flagged, and what percentage of your population is flagged. So if you need to report numbers up to the district level or the state level, you can use this tool to help you do that. And then also, the last report that I'm going to show you, again, this is just a very short sampling of what we have available, is the individual student report, and I've also provided copies of that. So if you just enter a student's ID, all the information that you've entered into the tool about this specific student becomes available. So if you can use this externally with an audience or team that you might want to work with to see what risk indicators they're displaying. Here's the intervention this student was in. Are these working? What else can we do for this student? And then the last thing to note about this tool is there's also, if any of the reports that are preset in the tool don't work for you, you have the ability to make a custom report based off any indicators you want to look at that are in the tool. So you can choose from any of the variables in the tool and run that report as well. And it's a nice feature if you just want to run an attendance report, for instance. That's not available as an actual report in the tool, but you can take all the attendance indicators and all of your students and run a report for that. So this is just, again, a quick demo of what the tool has to offer. I did not get into all of the specific reports that are available, but feel free to look at those. I have plenty of extra copies available. And if you want more information, here's the website where the EWS tool is available for free download. And we also have many supporting documents that go along with this. So an implementation guide, I talked about that cycle. We've written a report about that. There's a technical manual, which gets into the really technical aspects of the tool, as well as sample data files that you can download to start messing around with the tool and playing with it to see if it will work for your population. So if there's any questions about the tool, I'll be happy to answer them at this point.
Hi, and just so you know, this is all on the conference website as well, so you can easily download it. We have time for like maybe 1 or 2 questions, and I do also want to say that Lindsay is available to come to your state and district planning teams to kind of show you the tool and that sort of thing. So if you have some detailed questions, that might be a good time to ask those.
Yes, my name is Damon Brightford from Baltimore. My question is, Lindsay, what is your understanding of the tool that was used to determine the effective strategies or implementations of the strategies that you just mentioned? And was that tool based upon and some influence of what was not taking place in the school or the community to assist and help the child?
So the interventions that I mentioned, there's a whole document that our center published on that. And what they did was looked at interventions deemed as effective from the What Works Clearinghouse. So they had their own criteria of how they deemed an intervention as effective as not. So we used those interventions that were deemed as effective and extracted the common strategies that they had which might help students who are at risk of dropout. So the specifics of the program, you can get the interventions, you can get more information in that resource that we have available.
And that was just a demo, I should say, that we developed, based on that research. The tool, You'll see in the implementation guide as we developed it, each has guiding questions, and we call them shorter and longer term questions. And some of the longer term questions deal with issues around school climate and bigger picture issues that you're talking about, like what's missing. So the idea is to move through this process and be able to look, hone in on students in real time so you're supporting them immediately, but not to miss the opportunity to look at some systemic things that might be going on in the school that you may need to make changes on. I think we have time for one more question, if you don't mind speaking into the mic.
We've been attempting to get our students to give us feedback on the different interventions that they've been participating in. Would the individual report that, the individual student report, do you think that it could be adapted so that it could be specifically used with students or with parents, in talking about their specific issues with their own children?
I think that's a great point, and we do, the report, as I mentioned, I don't think it really would need to be adapted. So you could print it out as is and share with the student. These are the factors that you're displaying which make you at risk for dropout. What do you think would be best help? How can we best help you get on track? And there's also a comments section available in the tool. You might have seen it briefly, but that's really where you can take notes about what the student says, what might be effective for him or her. And I think it's actually a great idea to involve the student, and so he or she can take ownership in helping themselves move towards graduation, as well as the parents. So I don't think that you would really need to adapt the report at all. There's examples of the individual student report that you could just print and give to a student and an EWS planning team.
Yeah, and I just want to say there are other people working on this early warning system type of work, and one report that we've seen that I personally love is something that's explicitly for the student and the parent that says you have missed 10 or more days of school. Students who miss this many days of school do not graduate on time. You need to improve your attendance. Kind of really direct and to the point. So that's sort of what it was based on, that idea. Okay, one more question.
Hi. I noticed that the program kind of stopped short. I don't know if it was just because of the demonstration. It stopped short of when you said student transferred out. It didn't necessarily define where the student went. And I know that a lot of the so-called dropout factories around the country are being defined based on students who come in and then at the end of 4 years that aren't there. But that doesn't necessarily tell the story of where they went, whether they were tracked to an alternative school or another part of the country they transferred to. So, I'm curious to see if you guys have anything that really can give us clear definition of or clear indicator of the actual dropouts that actually took place.
Yeah, so there is a transfer out. I'm not sure if you saw this. There is also, I'll just quickly move to it. You can tag a student as being dropped out as well. So transfer out does not mean dropout in the tool. But also there's a place within here. So if the enrollment status changes, there's these 5 things. So a student can either transfer out or drop out. There's also a place, as you mentioned, to say what happened to the student, where did they go. So there's a common section further down in the tool here where you can write that type of information, and this will always be available to you. So if you're looking up what happened to a student, you notice they're grayed out in the tool, you can always refer back to this section and track that information there.
Okay, thank you. So next up is Kathleen Smith, who's the Director of School Improvement at the Virginia Department of Education.
This one?
Chicago.
And it's thanks to Kathleen and some folks in Texas as well that a lot of this implementation and the tool itself have been informed by the practice of individuals in schools and in districts. So.
Okay,
Kathleen.
I guess you guys can hear me. I wanted to come down because I'm too short. Sit up there. So some of the slides that I have you've already seen, so I'm going to be able to go through this rather quickly and really get to some questions because we have used this system. It was sort of a brainchild that we had, and we got together a group of people and put this together and asked the National High School Center to help us with it. And so what you just saw was really what we wanted. This was our dream. We started, go ahead and click. We started, go back there. We started a few years ago, actually about 2.5, 3 years ago now, 3 years, with a group of people that said, we've got some serious issues with graduation rate. We need to change some things. What is it that we need to support our schools in Virginia? And that's how this tool developed. All of this for the state people, I just want you to know, has not cost us anything in terms of money. Human capacity, some, but even with that, the National High School Center has really provided us with an exceptional tool that's now available to everyone at no cost to Virginia other than the time that we took to build a very small pilot, and it cost us nothing to implement other than our own time. And so I want you to know that it's part of a national organization that provides support to states who can then provide support to districts who then provide it to schools. And so that's what I'm going to show you today. And you can flip that. Go ahead and flip that. And so this was our graduation rate when we started, and we were not happy, especially with two categories, limited English proficient students and students with disabilities. In fact, we were pretty embarrassed by the data. And as a result of that, and go ahead and click, our Board of Education decided to accredit high schools because we have no Title I high schools in the state of Virginia. And as a result of having no Title I high schools in the state of Virginia, AYP didn't really matter, okay? And so our Board of Education decided that they would, on the state side, accredit high schools based on graduation rate beginning in 2011, the next year coming up, on their graduation class, in their ninth grade class 4 years ago. So the kids graduating this year, they've had now for 4 years, their graduation rate will determine whether they're accredited or they're not accredited. In Virginia, most of our schools that are high schools are in small divisions. We don't have a lot of large divisions. We have very small districts, divisions, districts, same thing. And so we're talking about the clipper ships having this huge flag on them that says accredited with warning. It's not going to be pretty, and we have about 70 of our high schools that'll probably be at that place in September when we do our accreditation based on the graduation rate this year in June, as well as the summer. We will add the summer graduates to it. And so doing that, we immediately knew, and you can click to the next slide, that we certainly had to have some early warning system in place. And I looked at one that I liked from Boston, and I said, you know what, this spreadsheet is wonderful. So Lindsay came to my office. We met with a few districts, and I'll share a little bit about those demographics in a minute. And I said, I want this for Virginia. And that's how the tool developed, from one spreadsheet to what you did see, which is much more than I ever hoped for and much more than our districts ever hoped for. But we were looking for a few things, and you can see some of those things, but go ahead and flip to the next slide. We knew all of this research, and we understood, we had looked at a lot of research coming out of the National High School Center, as well as Chicago, as well as Johns Hopkins, on what caused or what we knew would indicate, but we didn't have any way of putting it in place to really monitor it. So we knew ninth grade was a critical make or break year, and that's where we started. Go ahead. So these are the key indicators that we decided to look at, and you can flip that because you guys have seen this. And then I want to talk about the Views tool. So we got together with a lot of people, and you can flip. Nope, this is it. Okay. So Franklin City is a very small city. It has about 600 students in their high school. Most are African American, and about 98% of the students are eligible for free and reduced lunch. High poverty. Lee County, on the other hand, is in the very southwest of Virginia. It's coal country. It's predominantly white. Highest poverty rate in the state of Virginia is in Lee County. So again, very high poverty, very different school district from Franklin City. Richmond City is our urban district that was in this project. Richmond City is a usual urban city. It's very typical urban. Mix of both affluent as well as a high rate of economically disadvantaged students as well. And Pulaski County is kind of like my middle-of-the-road county in Virginia that looks like most of our districts. It did not have a dropout problem, And so we had 3 with a very high dropout rate in certain subgroups, Richmond City, Lee County, and Franklin City. And then we had Pulaski that did not. And so we brought those guys together. We met in my department, and I said, okay, first thing I want you to do before we even begin this is tell me who you think, for your 8th graders that are now coming into 9th grade, who you think is most at risk of not graduating on time. Because that was our first way of knowing. If you think that, then you ought to be able to prove that with data. And that's how we started. And so that's what we wanted to know. It was just the way that we did it. And that's how we began. That was our first validation process for the pre-high school index. We wanted to determine if those factors that were found in research were also true for Virginia. And actually what we did find, it was absolutely on target. In the highest poverty district, in a high poverty white district, high poverty African American district, as well as a very middle of the road Virginia district and an urban district. It held true. And then we wanted an implementation guide, because my thing is, I can show you the data, but if you don't know how to use it, I'm still kind of stuck. So I like to go to the process, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. And then we just wanted to continue to refine the tool, which they did. We went from one Excel spreadsheet, which was my dream, to, I really only wanted one Excel spreadsheet, to a massive tool. So that was just to let you know how we did pilot it. Go ahead. And so the other thing that I wanted is a way for districts to get this information quick, okay? So we wanted to be able to use the current databases that most of our divisions use. Current would be Power School, Current, SASE, Star-based. Those particular databases, we wanted them to be able to operate without a principal having to input this data manually. And so that has been accomplished. You can literally, we have something called a CIF file on top of all of our student database systems that actually allows them to have the same language. And so the language in that CSV file, I don't know anything about technology. I will tell you, I've learned a little bit, but that's all importable. So the big thing is, what it means to me, principals don't have to input this by hand. That's critical. So just to get to that point. We wanted to be able to look at our own thresholds and base those thresholds on what we saw in Virginia, and we were able to do that. And the one key that we did not feel, our school divisions, Lee, Pulaski, Franklin City, Richmond, really felt that behavioral indicators, referrals, and suspensions should be included. We had no research to back that up, and we could not validate that in our data. So when we went to validate this tool with their data, we couldn't validate it. We left it out of the tool, but it's optional. So they can use it if they want to as an indicator, but it's not an indicator that we could validate. And we've told our school districts that. And so what we have now is any school that's accredited with warning in the fall now has a tool to go by, and they have a process. And I'll give you a little more about that process. And so what I'm going to require is that any school that's accredited with warning, they're going to identify who's at risk coming up, and they're going to identify who's at risk currently in 9th grade, as well as those kids throughout the year. So they're going to be using this tool. Go ahead. Keep going. This is the same thing that you've seen, so I'm going to skip these things. You can see we pulled it right off. This is where I wanted to get to. And so it provides us with a structure. It's just a structure that then you can look at the process and come up with continuous improvement. But it's only a tool, and it's just a tool unless you do something with the tool. So I'm going to give you a little bit about, go ahead to the next slide, I think, a little bit about some of the things that happened when we put this in place. In Lee County, 2 things came up. When we ran the data, remember this was the predominantly white, very, very poor, highest poverty county in the coal fields. The coal mines have closed, so guess why kids drop out of school? You don't even have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. They were dropping out primarily to earn money for the household. And that didn't surprise us. But something else came out of that data that did surprise us. The students that were at risk in Lee County were very different from the students who are at risk in Franklin City and in Richmond and in Pulaski, and that those particular students did not need academic interventions. They were dropping out with full credits. So that was very different data. What do you do with that? Well, you know, you got to start thinking about how do you get a virtual school going so that these kids can still work and can still earn credits. That was very imperative. The other data set that they found, and this is, I just think this is amazing, they call it the Great Gatsby effect. They had one teacher who taught the Great Gatsby for 9 weeks, and the kids who dropped out did not like the Great Gatsby. It was very obvious in their course failures. And so they actually, you know, kind of retired her to a different class, not teaching the Great Gatsby, and, you know, help some kids get that credit, which was imperative. It's amazing. They called it the Great Gatsby effect. But in Franklin City, in Richmond, and Pulaski, we did find a high. We really thought when we first asked these divisions, what do you think is needed? They all said, well, they don't come to school. We're going to have attendance. We're going to have to do something about attendance. But when they really looked at the data, what they found is that if you can't read on grade level, do you think you're going to be engaged enough to stay in school? No. So the attendance was really an outcome of not being able to read well. And so they went back and started looking at how are we going to get these kids that are coming into 9th grade reading on grade level in a very short period of time. Well, we have wrestled with that this year. I will tell you, it's not easy because what do English teachers in 9th grade want to teach? Romeo and Juliet in Virginia, that's a huge unit. Shakespeare is a huge unit. Why are you teaching a kid Romeo and Juliet on a block period for 90 minutes when he can't read on the 6th grade level? You are disengaging him for at least 90 minutes a day. Let's not talk about the other 3 blocks of time if you're on a block schedule at 90 minutes in history, in science, and in other areas. And so looking at scheduling and how you're using and the opportunity for those children to learn, really learn, is critical. So that's something we have struggled with, I think, this year, but the data was there, and teachers can't argue with it. It's there in black and white. They can't argue with it. And so that's been very helpful, just having it there for the conversation. Go ahead and flip it. We are going to require and have required in our school districts this year that we've worked with under the SIG grant, which is something different, and as well as these 4 districts that we worked with, we put together a district team. And so part of it, if you think about it, some of this stuff isn't rocket science. They didn't get to 9th grade not reading. Somebody didn't teach them before they got there. So it doesn't do you any good to have a high school team if you're going to not do anything about the number of kids coming year after year after year to a high school not ready to read. So on our district team, we want to look backwards and figure out what in the heck can we do to keep these kids or get these kids to grade level. And I'll tell you something, what we found this year, gets the critical year, 3rd grade. 3rd grade, critical year. Just going back, and you dig further back, and you dig further back in the data. These kids were failing in 3rd grade. I ran a set on the 174 schools that we're working with this year, some elementary, some middle, some high school. And I asked in the query how many students had failed the English test 3 consecutive years. So 4th, 5th, and 6th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. How many have failed it 3 consecutive years? In 174 schools, 13,000 students. It's pitiful. And then I said, okay, how many of those 13,000 failed it in 3rd grade as well? 4,072. So it just caused us to look at our data and say, we're going to go back and take a look at what we're doing to kids, because obviously we're not getting them to where they need to be. So that's important. Next one is this tells us, the district team tells us how to prevent students. I think that's critical. I want to go to a couple slides up. This is the school team, and I want to show you. This is what the purpose of the district team, I think, does this. Should be school team, excuse me, not district team, is what do you have to do right now when they come to high school? That's the interventions. And then this came up about a couple weeks ago. I was at something with Michael Fullen, and he was talking about Ontario and how they increased their graduation rate. And you know what? It never really occurred to me. We've been so focused on 9th grade and on 3rd grade that what are we doing with the kids that, in Lee County, they're the ones that really, it hit me. They focused on the kids that have left school. They've increased their graduation rate considerably because they went and looked and said, you know what? These kids could have graduated. They had enough credits. We just need to get them a couple more. They weren't that far off. So that's recovering. I wanted to show that to you because I think that's important. You can flip the slide. So I think the three things are intervention, prevention, and recovery. It's going to help you a lot in terms of getting kids to graduating on time. The rest of this, and you can click through, is really on the team process and what we're doing, and that is the Views tool. All of that came through. We're using the same process, the same materials that were developed by the National High School Center. You can flip through that, just keep flipping. Same step, and the schools have really found this very, very valuable, and that it gives a principal the structure to sit down and say, when you see this implementation guide, you'll see it. Oh, here are the questions that I need to ask of my guidance team. Here are the questions I need to ask of my leadership team. So you don't have to sit there and figure them out and say, folks, what are we going to do about the graduation rate? It's there for you. The questions are there, and it will force you to go through your data in a very structured manner to come up with things that you're going to have to dig deeper to get at. It doesn't stop there, but it gets you at least where you need to be. And you can flip through all of that. And so we do use the tiered approach. And let me tell you some high school folks, you all think, you used to pay attention to that rate response to intervention. My high school people never paid attention to because they thought it was an elementary Title I program. It's not. It really, really works when you talk about the graduation rate. Pay attention to it. But it goes back to this, is that the 8 elements of high school reform, which is the implementation manual, it will help you with the process. Just flip forward. Go again. Okay. This is a book. It's a self-assessment. It is online. It was developed by the National High School Center. We are requiring this of any school that's accredited with warning. The team, the district team, and the school team will work together to go through this self-assessment, and it'll take them a year. I do not want this done in 2 days. It will take them a year to go through that assessment and come up with a good plan. I don't want a 2-day plan, and I don't want a 30-page plan. I want about 5 things that you've got to do at the district level and at the school level. If you have 20, you'll never do them. So that's the whole purpose, is we could think of all kinds of things, but narrowing it down and beginning to focus. And so next year, my schools will be in that process. And I think I've got 1 minute left. So is that good?
Okay. Thank you, Kathleen. So are there any other questions? Are there any questions specifically for Kathleen or for any of the other presenters at this point, too?
Hello, Steve Underwood from Idaho. Kathleen, or even folks from the National Center, you've referenced RTI, you've referenced the multi-tier prevention system, and what I often find is that it's easy to keep all these different things in boxes, but it seems like they all fall under RTI in terms of academic RTI, PBIS, early warning system. Do you have any guidance documents or anything in the works that would give district leadership, for example, a way to say, okay, we're using an RTI framework. If your need is this, go with early warning. If your need is this, go with academic RTI. Do you have anything like that?
I don't, but I will tell you one thing. One thing I've talked a lot about to the schools that I have been working with, RTI is a really school improvement strategy. Level 1, Tier 1 is nothing more than general school improvement. Tier 2 is a more focused approach, and Tier 3 is serving some students that aren't going to be covered. It just makes sense. But I will tell you, in the schools that I've been working with for the past 2 summers, we have had large come to sit and get in service, and it's all been focused around student supports, okay? How to hold their hand and make them better. Well, you know, frankly, I'm a special educator. It's fluffy stuff, folks. You can't hold somebody's hand, teach them to read. So, I mean, that's the bottom line. If they can't read and they can't read well, they're not going to graduate. So we really need to focus on how you integrate the fluffy supports with the academic supports. And, you know, that is something that I'm having a really hard time doing. And what I have managed to move someone with the fluffy supports from special ed into my office. And her first comment to me was, so, you know, you keep talking about instruction. You keep talking about instruction. I said, look, your job is to help me integrate the fluffy supports. And she said, well, why do you call them fluffy? They are fluffy. You can't have instruction. I need both. So your job is to help with instruction, but not off by itself, sitting there, not integrated. That's exactly why I did that. We've got to integrate them.
Can I also just add, what Kathleen's referring to is this idea that the early warning system, as well as other data that you have, really transcends school improvement in general. And we call it interventions on the early warning system cycle, but interventions may be a misnomer in some ways, because people typically think of your typical dropout prevention programs, but when we're talking about interventions, we're talking about supports, like regular old supports. The reason a student is disengaging from school could be, you know, there are many reasons. And so the idea is, if it's academic, if they can't read, then that's a support that you probably already have, you may or may not already have in the school, but there are academic supports that already exist in the school. So when you're thinking about intervention and early warning, you probably have a lot going on in schools and districts already that could be used. It's just a different way of targeting and referring these students to access these supports.
And they come out of silos. I mean, we have to unsilo. We have to unsilo services and academics. They've got to be unsiloed.
What I was just thinking too, and I agree with everything that you guys have just said, is just that commonality of terms often helps us move forward. So like in RTI, you've got screening, progress monitoring, database decision making, and whatever the fourth critical component is, escaping my head. But when you talk about screening in kindergarten, it might be a DIBELS-based reading screener, and that's going to get your at-risk thing. But screening in this regard is your warning system data. And then you go from there to diagnostic data. Okay, now that I know that they're at risk, diagnostic, why are they showing these indicators, right? And then we put them in whatever our support program is and monitor progress. So, I mean, it's just the same framework. So I was just sitting here thinking, okay, how could I help my districts move forward in seeing the same framework, seeing the same language, but accessing the right piece at the right time. So anyways, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We have about a minute or two, I think. Okay.
Don't think I don't like Fluffy. I do. I love to pet Fluffy. It's very nice. But, you know.
Okay, seeing none, as we said, all this information is available on the conference webpage, so if you need to access anything, and available links. And if you have any questions for the presenters, they'll be around for a little bit longer, so feel free to direct and ask any questions that you might have that are specific to your needs. And I thank you all for participating. Have a good day.